I always prided myself on being rational, logical, grounded in reality. But things have changed, and I don't know if they're real or if I've lost myself. My doctor says it's psychosis, and with it, strange instructions that make no sense. Yet, here I am, compelled to follow them, even as they tear apart everything I've known. I wish I could say I believed him. But it's not the hallucinations that scare me. It's the rules he gave me to survive them. It's strange how life can splinter without warning. 1 minute you're fine. No, better than fine. You're managing, maybe even thriving, despite the stress and complications. Then, something shifts, quietly at first, like a slight imbalance in the way you walk, or a whisper in a room you thought was empty. For me, that something started a few months ago. At first, it was small things, easily explained away. Missing keys, misplaced phone, that sort of thing. I laughed it off. I mean, who hasn't had those moments, right? But when it escalated, that's when I realized things were different. Daniel Harper, I said aloud, standing in front of the bathroom mirror. 32 years old, college graduate, accountant, nothing special. Just an ordinary man leading an ordinary life. At least that's what I kept telling myself. But lately, ordinary didn't seem to fit anymore. The headaches had started first. Sharp, piercing pains that sliced through my temples, followed by a wave of nausea. Then came the flickers, brief flashes at the edges of my vision, like shadows darting behind my eyes. Always too fast to catch, too subtle to fully notice. I ignored it for weeks, but when I started hearing voices, no, not voices exactly, more like murmurs, things I couldn't quite make out but knew were there, I had no choice but to seek help. Not because I thought I was crazy, but because I thought there was something wrong with me. That's when I met Dr. Gregory Shaw, a specialist in psychosis, he said. Middle-aged, with a well-trimmed beard, and those wire-rimmed glasses that made him look like an old-timey scholar. His office was dimly lit, probably to keep things calm. I liked him immediately. He had an aura of control, of authority, someone who could explain what was happening to me. I told him everything, about the voices, the shadows, the headaches. He listened quietly, nodding as if he had heard it all before. But then, when I finished, he leaned back in his chair, a strange smile playing on his lips. "It sounds like the onset of psychosis, Daniel." I felt a cold wave wash over me. Psychosis? That word carried weight. It wasn't something to brush off, wasn't just a case of stress or overwork. It was something much, much darker. "But don't worry," Dr. Shaw continued. "There are ways to manage it. Medications, therapy. But in your case, I want to try something a bit different." My heart was still hammering in my chest from the word psychosis, but I forced myself to listen. Different? He slid a piece of paper across the desk toward me, his fingers hovering over it for a second too long, as if debating whether to hand it over. I picked it up and squinted at the words scrawled across the page. They were simple. Too simple. "What is this?" I asked, frowning. "Instructions. Rules, really. If you follow them, it should help with your episodes. Ground you in reality." I looked down at the paper again. There were 5 rules listed, each more bizarre than the last. 1. Turn off all lights by 10:13 p.m. every night. No exceptions. 2. Check the window exactly 3 times before locking it. No more, no less. 3. If you hear your name being called after 2 a.m., Do not respond. 4. Leave one drawer in your kitchen open before you go to bed. 5. Do not, under any circumstances, look in the mirror after midnight. I blinked, waiting for him to laugh, to tell me this was some kind of joke. But he didn't. His expression remained calm, serious even. What is this supposed to do? I asked, bewildered. It's about control, he said softly. Psychosis is, at its core, a breakdown of your mind's ability to interpret reality. These rules, he pointed at the paper, give you something to focus on. Something real. Something you can control, even when everything else seems to slip away. I wanted to argue, to say it was absurd, but the truth was, I didn't know what else to do. And if this was what it took to stop the voices, to get rid of the shadows, maybe it was worth a shot. I nodded, folding the paper into my pocket. That night, I followed the rules. I turned off the lights at 10:13 sharp. I checked the window 3 times, not 2, not 4. And I didn't respond when I heard my name, Daniel, whispered softly from the dark corner of my bedroom at 2:23 a.m. The next day, I felt better. Not completely normal, but better. But then, things started to shift again. Slowly, at first, but undeniably. The voices grew louder, clearer. They weren't just whispers anymore. They were conversations, urgent, frantic. Sometimes they screamed my name, but I followed the rules. I never responded. I never looked in the mirror after midnight. Never. A few days later, I noticed something else. A presence. A feeling of being watched, even when I was alone. I'd catch glimpses of figures in the corner of my eye, only for them to vanish when I turned my head. I told Dr. Shaw about it, but he just smiled, his eyes glinting behind those wire-rimmed glasses. It's all part of the process, Daniel. Keep following the rules. You'll be fine. But something in his voice, no, in his eyes, made me question everything. Fine? I didn't feel fine. In fact, I felt like I was slowly losing my grip. Still, I kept to the rules, as ridiculous as they seemed, until one night, when I made a mistake. Mistakes happen, right? I mean, that's what makes us human. We slip up. We forget things. But what if a mistake costs you your sanity? What if, in the dark hours of the night, your mind becomes your worst enemy? I had followed Dr. Shaw's rules to the letter for days, even though they felt more like superstitions than actual medical advice. But I stuck to them because, well, what choice did I have? The voices were still there, the shadows still danced at the edges of my vision, but they hadn't gotten worse. Not until that night. It started like any other. I finished dinner, watched some mindless TV, then started my nightly ritual of checking the rules. I'd memorized them by now, but I still liked to glance at the paper just to be sure. 1. Turn off all lights by 10:13 p.m. 2. Check the window exactly 3 times before locking it. 3. If you hear your name being called after 2 a.m., do not respond. 4. Leave one drawer in your kitchen open before you go to bed. 5. Do not, under any circumstances, look in the mirror after midnight. The rules didn't scare me anymore. They felt almost mundane, like brushing my teeth or setting my alarm. I knew them by heart, and that gave me a false sense of control over the chaos in my mind. But then, something happened that I didn't anticipate. That night, I got home late from work. Deadlines had piled up at the office, and I lost track of time. By the time I stepped through my front door, it was already 10:05. I remember glancing at my watch, my heart racing. I didn't have much time. I rushed through the house, flipping off lights, closing the curtains and locking the doors. It wasn't until I reached the last room, the bathroom, that I checked my watch again. 10:14. I froze, standing there in the dim bathroom light, staring at my reflection. I was late. I had missed the 10:13 deadline. My stomach churned, my skin prickled with a cold sweat. It was just a minute late. 1 minute. What could that possibly change? I turned off the light anyway, hoping, praying that maybe it wouldn't matter. Maybe the rules weren't as rigid as they seemed. After all, Dr. Shaw had never explained why they were important, just that I had to follow them. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I followed the rest of the routine, checked the window 3 times, left a drawer open, ignored the whisper of my name at 2:17 a.m. I thought I'd escaped the consequences, but I was wrong. The next morning, something felt off. The air in my apartment seemed thicker, like it was pressing down on me. There was a heavy stillness that I couldn't quite shake. I tried to brush it off, but the feeling clung to me like a shadow. It wasn't until I walked into the kitchen that I noticed it. The drawer I had left open the night before, the one I always left open, was closed. My breath caught in my throat. I hadn't touched it. I was sure of that. It was part of the routine. The drawer stays open, but now it was shut, almost mockingly. I stood there, staring at it, feeling a creeping sense of unease crawl up my spine. Had someone else been in my apartment? But that didn't make sense. The doors were locked, the windows secure. No one could have gotten in. I hesitated, then slowly opened the drawer, half expecting to find... what? I didn't know. Nothing. It was empty. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. Just a mistake. Maybe I closed it by accident. My mind was playing tricks on me. I had broken one rule last night, and now everything felt wrong, like the universe had subtly shifted around me. But the day continued without incident, and soon I began to feel foolish for worrying. It was just a drawer. Just a minute. Nothing bad had happened. I had dodged the bullet, or so I thought. That night, I was determined not to slip up again. I was home by 9:30, in bed by 10, all lights out by 10:13 exactly. I followed the rules meticulously, even counting out loud as I checked the window. 1, 2, 3, done. But the moment I laid my head on the pillow, I felt it. The presence. It was subtle at first, like a pair of eyes watching from the dark corners of my room. My heart sped up, but I forced myself to ignore it. I hadn't heard anything. I hadn't seen anything. It was just my mind, playing tricks again. Then, I heard it. A soft shuffle of feet against the hardwood floor. I bolted upright, eyes darting to the darkened corner near the door. There was nothing. Just shadows. My breath came fast, my pulse hammering in my ears. Daniel. The voice was unmistakable this time, clear, sharp, right in the room with me. My muscles tensed, every instinct screaming at me to respond, to call out, to demand to know who or what was there. But I remembered the rule. 3. If you hear your name being called after 2 a.m., do not respond. It was 2:05. My body trembled, fingers gripping the sheets as I squeezed my eyes shut. Don't respond. Don't respond. But the voice didn't stop. Daniel, I know you're awake. It was closer now. Too close. I could feel its breath on the back of my neck, feel the weight of it standing behind me, watching, waiting. I fought the urge to turn around to look, but I didn't. I stayed frozen, clinging to the rules as though they were the only thing keeping me tethered to reality. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. I couldn't tell. But eventually, the room fell silent again. The presence faded. I let out a shaky breath, my body soaked in cold sweat. The rules had saved me. I was sure of it. If I had spoken, if I had looked, something terrible would have happened. But what? What was it that I was avoiding? The next morning, I called Dr. Shaw. "I think I made a mistake," I said, pacing back and forth in my living room. I told him about the drawer, the voice, the presence. He listened carefully, as always, then responded with that calm, unnerving tone. "I warned you, Daniel. The rules aren't flexible, but it's not too late. You just have to keep following them. If you do, everything will be fine." "What happens if I don't?" I blurted out, finally giving voice to the fear that had been gnawing at me. For the first time since I had known him, Dr. Shaw paused. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, almost hesitant. "You don't want to know, Daniel. Trust me on this. Keep following the rules." I hung up the phone, feeling no more reassured than I had before. The rules were supposed to help me, but it was starting to feel like they were the problem. Or maybe, just maybe, there was something far worse behind them. The following days passed in a haze. I kept to the rules like my life depended on it, and maybe it did. Every night, I triple-checked everything. The lights went off at 10:13 p.m. The window was checked exactly 3 times, the drawer stayed open, and I ignored every voice that called out in the dark. But the presence, that presence, was always there, watching, waiting. It felt closer each night, its breath hot on my skin, its weight heavy in the room. But I never turned around, never responded, not once. And yet, I was beginning to question whether following the rules was keeping me safe or driving me mad. It was a Thursday when things truly escalated. I had gone through the routine, lights off, window checked, drawer left open. Everything seemed fine, normal, until around 1 a.m. when I woke up to the sound of footsteps. Not just the usual faint shuffling, but deliberate, slow footsteps, as if someone was pacing right outside my bedroom door. I sat up in bed, straining to listen. My apartment was small, too small for anyone to be inside without me knowing. But the footsteps continued, dragging along the hallway, stopping just before my door. My heart pounded in my chest. Was it a hallucination? Was this what psychosis really felt like? The handle of my bedroom door rattled. Just once, I froze. "Daniel," the voice whispered, soft but unmistakably close. Too close. "Let me in." My skin crawled. I squeezed my eyes shut, gripping the covers so tightly my knuckles turned white. The rule, the goddamn rule, echoed in my mind. 3. If you hear your name being called after 2 a.m., do not respond. It wasn't 2 a.m. yet, but I knew better than to respond. I knew that much. I stayed still, willing the presence to go away. The footsteps resumed, this time softer, fading away down the hall. I opened my eyes slowly, my heart still racing, but the room was empty. My bedroom door was still shut, the air thick with the lingering tension of something unseen. For a long moment, I sat there, listening, waiting for something else to happen. And then, I heard it. A quiet scraping sound coming from the kitchen. I wanted to ignore it, pretend that nothing was wrong. But the sound persisted, growing louder, more deliberate. It wasn't the familiar creak of my apartment settling, or the distant hum of the fridge. It was something else entirely, something intentional. I swung my legs out of bed, heart pounding in my chest as I made my way down the hall toward the kitchen. The air felt heavier with every step I took. The darkness seemed thicker, the shadows more oppressive. When I reached the kitchen, I stopped dead in my tracks. The drawer, the one I always left open, was moving. Slowly. Just barely. It slid open and shut in rhythmic, measured intervals, as though something, was toying with it. But there was no one there. The room was empty. Completely empty. I stood there, paralyzed with fear, watching as the drawer continued its eerie dance. My mind raced, desperate for a logical explanation. Was it a draft? A mechanical issue? But there were no drafts. No mechanisms that would explain what I was seeing. I took a step closer, feeling the chill creep down my spine. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the drawer. It opened one final time, then stopped, wide open. My breath caught in my throat. A low, guttural voice came from the darkness of the kitchen. "Daniel." I spun around, half expecting to see someone standing behind me, but the room was empty. My heart raced, my skin prickling with dread. That was when I noticed something else. The lights. The overhead kitchen light, the one I had turned off, was flickering. The rule. I had turned off the lights at 10:13 p.m. exactly. I was sure of it. I was always sure. But now, the light was on. Just barely. Flickering like a dying flame. I backed away slowly, panic clawing at my chest. Something was wrong. I had followed the rules, hadn't I? I hurried back to my room, slamming the door shut behind me. I didn't want to admit it, not to myself, but I knew something had gone horribly wrong. It felt like I had been tricked. The presence, the voices, the drawer, they were pushing me toward something, inch by inch, like they were testing me, waiting for me to slip. The next day, I went to see Dr. Shaw. I needed answers. Real answers. No more cryptic advice. No more rules without explanations. He sat in his office as calm and collected as ever, sipping his tea as though nothing was wrong in the world. His office was just as dimly lit as usual, the same eerie calm radiating from the walls. I sat down, my fingers trembling, and told him everything. About the footsteps, the drawer, the flickering light. He listened, as he always did, with that same expression of mild curiosity. When I finished, he leaned back, tapping his fingers together thoughtfully. "You missed the deadline for turning off the lights, didn't you?" he said softly. I nodded, my stomach twisting with unease. "Just by a minute. 1 minute. That's enough." He set his cup down carefully, his gaze piercing through me in a way that made me feel exposed. "The rules aren't just guidelines, Daniel. They're boundaries. You crossed one. And now..." He paused, tilting his head slightly. "Now something else has crossed into your world." I swallowed hard. "What do you mean, something else? What's happening to me?" He sighed, leaning forward, his hands clasped together. "Psychosis is one explanation, but I think we both know it's more than that, don't we? You're not just hallucinating. You've invited something in, and it's watching you now." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I felt lightheaded, my mind struggling to grasp what he was saying. What is it?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "It's not something I can describe, Daniel." He stood up and walked to the window, gazing out into the dim light of the city beyond. "It's an entity, a presence that lives in the spaces we don't see. It exists in the cracks between reality, and by breaking the rules, you've let it in." I stared at him, unable to believe what I was hearing. "You knew this would happen?" I knew it was a possibility. He turned to face me, his expression unreadable. "But you're not lost yet. You can still manage it. The rules will keep it at bay. And if I don't? He didn't answer. The silence was suffocating, his refusal to respond more terrifying than any answer he could have given. I left his office feeling more confused and afraid than I had when I arrived. I needed to understand what was happening, why the rules existed, and what exactly was haunting me. That night, I did everything perfectly. Lights off at 10:13 sharp. I checked the window exactly 3 times, left the drawer open, and stayed awake, counting the minutes until 2 a.m., determined not to let my guard down. But when 2 a.m. came and the voice whispered my name again, I did something I had never done before. I looked in the mirror. The moment I looked into the mirror, I regretted it. It wasn't just fear. It was something deeper, something primal, a feeling that clawed at my insides and screamed for me to look away. But I couldn't. I stared at my reflection, expecting to see something wrong, something twisted. My reflection was just me, but only at first. There was nothing unusual about the way I looked. My messy brown hair, the tired bags under my eyes, the faint stubble on my chin. It was all there, perfectly normal. But as the seconds ticked by, I noticed the slight flicker, the faintest twitch in the reflection that didn't match my own movement. At first, I thought it was just my exhausted mind, playing tricks on me. But then I realized it wasn't. The reflection, the me in the mirror, was blinking slower, breathing slower, and staring at me with a hollow, unnerving intensity. It wasn't me anymore. My heart raced. I stepped back from the mirror, but my reflection didn't. It stayed frozen in place, staring. And then slowly, it smiled. It was a grotesque grin, too wide, stretching my lips far beyond what felt natural, like something trying to mimic the shape of a smile, but not understanding how human expressions worked. I blinked. My reflection didn't. The thing that looked like me leaned forward, still grinning, its eyes never leaving mine. My breath caught in my throat as I backed further away, the hair on my arms standing on end. I couldn't understand what I was seeing, couldn't make sense of it. Then, it moved its lips. Daniel. It whispered my name, but the voice wasn't coming from the mirror. It was coming from behind me. I spun around, heart pounding, but the room was empty. My bedroom door was closed, the shadows in the corners still. But the voice, it had been right there, right behind me. I turned back to the mirror, my body trembling. The reflection was gone. I blinked in disbelief, my reflection returning to normal, staring back at me with wide, terrified eyes. I stumbled back, heart racing, my mind scrambling to process what had just happened. The room around me felt suffocating, the air thick with an oppressive weight. What had I done? What had I unleashed? The next morning, I couldn't bring myself to look in the mirror again. I avoided it completely, afraid of what I might see, or what might see me. My hands shook as I prepared my breakfast, the sunlight streaming in through the window doing little to ease the chill that had settled in my bones. I didn't call Dr. Shaw. I couldn't. I didn't trust him anymore. Not after what he had said about the presence, about the rules. He had known all along what was happening to me, what these rules were really for. But he hadn't told me the truth. He had just let it happen. But why? I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the drawer I always left open. It was still open, just as the rules demanded, but now it felt like a gateway, a crack through which something was watching. I could feel it. The presence was everywhere now, not just at night. It had seeped into every corner of my life. That's when I heard it. A soft knock. I froze, my fork halfway to my mouth. The knock came again, this time louder, coming from the front door. My heart sank. I wasn't expecting anyone. I approached the door cautiously, my pulse thundering in my ears. When I reached the peephole, I hesitated before looking through. Something told me not to, that whatever was on the other side wasn't human. But curiosity won, and I pressed my eye against the cold glass. There was no one there. I exhaled in relief, stepping away from the door. But then the knock came again, this time from behind me. I whipped around, my heart hammering in my chest. It was coming from the kitchen, from the drawer. No, no, no. I crept toward the kitchen, every muscle in my body tense as the knocking continued, rhythmic, deliberate. It echoed in the quiet of the apartment, filling the space with an unbearable tension. My eyes locked onto the open drawer. It was as if the knock was coming from inside. My hand shook as I reached for the drawer handle, pulling it open wider. Nothing. It was empty, just as it had always been. But the knocking continued, louder now, coming from somewhere deeper, like there was something beneath the drawer, some hidden layer I couldn't see. I slammed the drawer shut and backed away, my breathing shallow. The knocking stopped instantly, leaving only a deafening silence in its wake. I sat down on the floor, my back against the wall, my mind spinning. The rules were unraveling, breaking down piece by piece, and I didn't know how to stop it. The presence was growing stronger, more persistent, and I didn't understand why. And then I remembered something Dr. Shaw had said. You've invited something in. That night, I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt it. The presence, lurking just beyond the edge of my awareness, watching, waiting for me to let my guard down. I went through the motions, following the rules, but they felt hollow now, meaningless. I knew that something had already crossed over, that I had let it in when I broke the first rule. Turning off the lights at 10:13 p.m., checking the window 3 times. It didn't matter anymore. The rules had been breached. Around midnight, I heard the voice again. Daniel. I ignored it, as always, burying my head under the pillow, trying to drown out the sound. Daniel, look at me. The voice was louder this time, more insistent. I felt a cold wave of dread wash over me. It was coming from the mirror. I knew it. I squeezed my eyes shut, every muscle in my body tense. Daniel, if you don't look, I'll come to you. I bolted upright in bed, my breath ragged. The voice wasn't lying. I could feel the truth of it in the air, in the way the shadows seemed to ripple in the darkness. If I didn't look, it would come to me. But if I did look, I would break the rule. My heart raced. What choice did I have? Slowly, I turned my head toward the mirror. My room was bathed in darkness, but I could make out the faint outline of the mirror hanging on the wall across from my bed. At first, I saw nothing, just the vague shape of my reflection in the dim light. But then, the reflection began to change. It moved when I didn't. My reflection was sitting up, just as I was, but its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, too far to the side. And it was smiling again, that grotesque grin stretching impossibly wide across its face. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The reflection raised its hand, beckoning me closer. Its fingers twitched and curled in a way that no human fingers should. And then it spoke. You shouldn't have broken the rules, Daniel. Now, you're mine. I stumbled out of bed, backing away from the mirror as the reflection began to move. Climbing out of the mirror, its twisted form stretching and contorting as it crawled toward me. I ran. I didn't know where I was going, only that I needed to get away. There's a strange calm that comes when you know you've lost. Not the panic or desperation you'd expect, just a cold, numb certainty that there's no way out. That's where I was. Standing in my darkened hallway, staring at the crack beneath my bedroom door as the presence, or whatever it was, slowly forced it open. The door creaked, inch by inch, revealing nothing but darkness beyond it. No reflection, no distorted figure crawling toward me. Just darkness. But I knew it was there, waiting, watching me. The words echoed in my head, the last thing the reflection had said before it crawled out of the mirror. The rules were never for your protection. They were for mine. It was free now. Free to do whatever it wanted. Free to follow me. I don't remember much of the next few minutes. I was running, stumbling through my apartment blind with fear. I tripped over furniture, knocked things over, but none of it mattered. I just had to get out. I reached the front door, hands shaking as I fumbled with the lock. I yanked it open, half expecting the presence to lunge at me from the shadows, but there was nothing. The apartment was silent. The hallway beyond was dark and empty, just as it had always been. I ran outside, down the stairs, through the lobby, and into the cold night air. I didn't stop until I was several blocks away, standing on a street corner under a flickering streetlight, gasping for breath. For a moment, I felt like I had escaped. The night was quiet, the city lights distant and calming. The presence wasn't here. It couldn't be. I was safe. Or so I thought. The next few days were a blur. I didn't go back to my apartment. I couldn't. Instead, I checked into a cheap motel on the edge of town, using the last of my savings to pay for a room. It wasn't much, just a bed, a chair, and a bathroom. But it felt like a sanctuary compared to the apartment. I didn't sleep much. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the reflection. That twisted smile. Those eyes, so empty, and yet so full of malice. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching me, waiting for me to make another mistake. On the third day, I finally broke down and called Dr. Shaw. He was the only one who could make sense of this, the only one who knew what was happening. He answered on the second ring, his voice as calm as ever. "Daniel," he said, as though he had been expecting my call, "I assume you've broken another rule." My throat tightened. "It's not just the rules," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "There's something in the apartment. It came out of the mirror. It's following me." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear him breathing, hear the faint scratch of a pen against paper, as though he was taking notes. "I told you, Daniel," he said finally. "The rules are not for your protection. They are for keeping it contained." My stomach churned with anger. "You knew this would happen," I spat. "You knew what was in that apartment, what was watching me. Why didn't you tell me?" Dr. Shaw sighed, the sound heavy with something I couldn't quite place. Regret? Resignation? "You wouldn't have believed me," he said simply. "You were skeptical of the diagnosis. You needed something concrete to hold on to, something you could follow. The rules served that purpose, but they were never about treating your psychosis." I clenched the phone tighter. What was it then? What is this thing? He hesitated, and for the first time since I'd met him, I heard a flicker of fear in his voice. "It's not something you can explain, Daniel. Not in terms that make sense to our understanding of reality. It's old, very old, and it's been watching you since the day you walked into my office." My blood ran cold. Watching me? Why? What does it want? It doesn't want anything, he said, his voice low. It just exists. But when you broke the rules, you opened a door that should have stayed shut. I felt a chill creep up my spine. A door? I echoed, trying to understand. What do you mean? What kind of door? He sighed, rubbing his temples as if the weight of his knowledge was too much to bear. There are things that linger on the edges of our reality, things that can't cross into our world unless we allow them to. The rules, they keep that boundary in place. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding. And by breaking them, he met my eyes, his expression grave. You didn't just invite it in, Daniel. You made it aware of you. Now it's here, and it won't leave. I felt my hands start to shake, a cold sweat breaking out on my skin. How do I stop it? There was another long pause. When Dr. Shaw spoke again, his voice was quiet, almost a whisper. You can't stop it. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My knees buckled, and I sank onto the edge of the motel bed, my heart pounding in my chest. Then why the rules? I asked, my voice cracking. Why give me these stupid rules if there's no way to stop it? He didn't answer immediately. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. Then finally he said, The rules aren't for your protection. They're for mine. I hung up the phone, feeling more lost than ever. The motel room felt smaller now, the walls pressing in on me. I could feel it, the presence, lurking just beyond the edges of my vision, waiting for the right moment to strike. I didn't know what to do. The rules were useless now. I had followed them as best I could, but it hadn't been enough. The presence had broken free, and I was completely powerless against it. I sat there in the darkness, my mind racing, trying to figure out a way to escape, to outrun this thing that was hunting me. And then, as I sat there, staring at the floor, a thought came to me. Something Dr. Shaw had said on the phone right before I hung up. Something I hadn't paid attention to at the time, lost in the chaos of everything else. The rules aren't for your protection. They're for mine. Why would Dr. Shaw need protection? What was he protecting himself from? And then it hit me. The rules weren't just a method of control for me. They were keeping him safe, too. Somehow, by giving me these rules, Dr. Shaw had been keeping the presence at bay, using me as a shield. But now that the presence was free, it wasn't just coming for me, it was coming for him, too. I didn't think. I acted on instinct, grabbing my coat and rushing out of the motel. My mind was racing, my pulse pounding in my ears. I didn't know what I was going to do when I reached Dr. Shaw's office, but I knew I had to confront him. I had to make him tell me everything. When I arrived, the building was dark, the lights off for the night. I pounded on the door, shouting his name, but there was no answer. My fists hammered against the glass, desperation taking over. He had to be here. He had to know how to stop this. After what felt like an eternity, the door swung open. Dr. Shaw stood there, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. He didn't say a word, just stared at me as though he had been expecting me all along. "It's here, isn't it?" I said, my voice trembling. He nodded, his face drawn and tired. "It's here, and it's too late." Before I could respond, the lights in the hallway flickered, and the temperature in the room dropped. The presence was here. I could feel it, watching us both, its eyes boring into my back. Dr. Shaw stepped aside, letting me into the office. I walked in, and the door closed softly behind me, sealing us in the dimly lit room. There was no escape now. "You knew this would happen," I whispered, my voice thick with anger and fear. He nodded, sitting down heavily at his desk. I tried to warn you, but some things can't be stopped. Once you see it, once it knows you can see it, there's no going back. The room grew colder. The shadows lengthened, pooling in the corners like dark, creeping vines. And then, in the silence that followed, I heard it. Daniel. The voice was soft, almost soothing now. It was no longer behind me. It was right beside me. I turned slowly, my eyes wide with terror, as the presence stepped out from the shadows. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything I could describe. It was a mass of darkness, shifting and undulating, its form constantly changing, never fully solid. But its eyes were real. They gleamed in the dim light, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Dr. Shaw stood up, his movements slow and deliberate, his face pale and drawn. The weight of everything was written in the deep lines of his face, like someone who had been carrying a burden for far too long. "There's one more thing you need to understand, Daniel," he said, his voice quiet but steady. I turned to him, feeling the air grow colder. My chest tightened, fear curling through me like smoke. "What is it?" Dr. Shaw's eyes darkened, a strange sadness creeping into his expression. He didn't speak for a long moment, as if searching for the right words, or perhaps dreading what he had to say next. His gaze shifted to the shadows gathering in the corners of the room. The rules were in place for a reason, but it's here now, and nothing will stop it. A cold shiver ran down my spine. The air seemed to thicken, pressing down on me. I could feel it, the presence, lurking, waiting for the final moment to reveal itself. My heart hammered in my chest, and for the first time, I felt a true, suffocating sense of hopelessness. "What is it?" I asked, my voice shaking. "What does it want?" Dr. Shaw's lips tightened into a thin line. "It doesn't want anything, Daniel. It's not something you can reason with. It's not something you can fight. It just is." I wanted to argue, to demand answers, but my mind was racing too fast to make sense of anything. The shadows in the room seemed to move, stretching out toward me, bending the space around us. The temperature plummeted, and I could barely breathe, as though the air itself had turned against me. Suddenly I felt it. Not just a presence, but eyes, watching, staring at me from the dark. Dr. Shaw stood frozen, his face pale and hollow. "You should never have broken the rules, Daniel." His voice trembled now, fear creeping into the words. "Once you did, it stopped being bound by them. It was waiting for that chance." I stumbled back, my chest tight, panic rising. "What can I do?" I asked, desperate. Dr. Shaw's eyes met mine, and I saw the defeat there. The kind of defeat that only comes when someone has been living in fear for far too long. He spoke in barely a whisper, but the words cut through the air like a blade. "There's nothing you can do." At that moment, the lights flickered, and the shadows deepened, swallowing the corners of the room. I could feel it closing in, creeping toward me. The presence, the thing, had always been here. It had been waiting, patient and relentless. I turned toward the door, my pulse racing, but before I could move, I heard Dr. Shaw's voice again. Not a warning, but a statement, an acceptance of what was coming. "It's already too late, Daniel. This is what happens when you break the rules. You can't outrun the consequences." I barely had time to process his words before the lights went out completely. The last thing I saw was a flash of movement in the darkness, something shifting, something coming for me,